Hi everyone, welcome to Spark Studio. My name is Paula. Today I'm sharing with you my Sapphire and Sunlight quilt. The name is actually based on the colors that I chose for it, so you might want to give it a different name if you go in a different color story, but it's a great opportunity to use up scraps. It is a table runner, so it's not a huge quilt. Join me. I hope that you'll enjoy our time together. Let's get started. I have my fabrics here. I use numbers on my cutting chart that you can follow. So this darkest one is actually my border. It doesn't have a number, but this is color 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is shades of the blues going from the darkest to the lightest. And then the golds are 5, 6, 7, and 8. And again, darkest to lightest. This quilt also works well with scraps. Feel free to use whatever fabrics you have around. Also a great opportunity for recycling and upcycling fabrics that might have had other purposes, but could also be used for this. So I'm going to start cutting with color number 1, which is this one here, and then we'll work our way. So fold this one in half. You want your edges even and the fold even. And of course, like always, I'm going to start by lining up on the bottom with a line on my mat and straighten this outside edge. And for this one, I need 3 2.5-inch strips. So I'm using the lines on my ruler. And then from one of these strips, trim the end. And I need 4 2.5-inch squares. So that's 2 because this one is folded in half. And there's my 4 2.5-inch squares. Then I need 8 that are 2.5 by 8.5. So I'm going to line up on the edge of my mat here. And there's 2 that are the 8.5. Now I need 8 of these all together. And this piece isn't big enough to cut 2 more, so I'm going to save that for right now and go to another strip. Actually, let's layer these. And we'll do an 8.5-inch cut. This one's going to give me 4 pieces. So that's 6 now, and then we'll just take one of these to do our last 2. So there's 8 that are 8.5 inches long, and then I need 4 pieces that are 4.5 inches long. So I can use this piece here, which is not long enough, and I'll layer it on this one. And this one I can simply use my ruler because 4.5 has a line on there. So there's my 4 4.5-inch pieces. So that's for color number 1. Color number 2. And I need 4 1.5-inch strips of this one. There are varying sizes for this. I need some that are 3.5 inches, some 4.5, 7.5, and 8.5. So I'm actually going to work backwards. I'm going to start with the 8.5 ones first. I need 4 of those. And this piece might work for another one here. And then I need 8 that are 7.5 inches. So for this one, I am going to layer 2 of these. So I'll get 4 at one time. So there's our 8 7.5-inch pieces. And then I need 4 that are 4.5. So this piece is big enough for that. And that's 4 there. And now I need 4 that are 3.5. So I'm going to get 2 of them out of this piece. And my last strip will give me the other 2. So there's our pieces for color number 2. It needs 3 2.5-inch strips. Don't have quite enough fabric. This is sometimes where you buy precisely the amounts you need, but I'm pretty sure with the cuts that I'm doing that won't be an issue, but I just have to be aware of that when I do my cuts. So we'll put that one aside, use it last. Again, with this one, I'm going to start with the longest ones, so I need 4 that are 7.5 inches. So that's 4. So there's 8 pieces that are 7.5 inches. Oops, I needed 4 pieces that are 7.5 inches. Oh, right. We can reuse those. Hopefully I'm not going to run out of fabric. I need 8 pieces that are 4.5, and I need 4 pieces that are 3.5. So I can cut 4.5-inch pieces from this one. So that's 4 of them. And then I'll use this one for the other 4. So there's my 8 4.5-inch. And I've got my 4 7.5-inch. So now I need 4 that are 3.5 inches. So I'm going to go over to this one. For 3.5-inch, just making sure that I get the right amount here. So there's 2 and 4. And then I'm going to use these ones to get the last pieces, which are 1.5 inches. And that's 4 pieces that are 1.5. So there's color number 3. And I need 2 1.5-inch strips off of this one. I need 4 pieces that are 6.5 inches long. So there's my 4. And then I need 12 1.5-inch squares. And those are the pieces for color number 4. So then we're moving into our golds or yellow fabrics. And this one is a larger piece of fabric because it is also going to be my binding. We'll start with the cuts for the diamonds and then we'll go from there. Now these diamonds are actually squares that are going to just be turned on an angle so they look like diamonds instead of squares. So for this one I need 1 2.5-inch strip. And since I have it laid out here for strips, let's do our binding as well. And I need 4 2.5-inch strips for that. I like a 2.5-inch strip for binding. Some people do 2.25. I just happen to like the 2.5. I find it a little easier to work with, a little more forgiving. Four strips for my binding, and then this 1 strip, and I need 8 2.5-inch squares. So I'm cutting 2 at a time here. 2, 4, 6, and 8. That's color number 5. And we need 1 2.5-inch strip on this one. And I need 10 2.5-inch squares off of this one. So I'm going to speed up the cutting here. Fold this over. trim off that fold. I don't always do this because I'm trying to save fabric, but because I need 10 of them. So then I'm going to get 4 at a time. So there's 4, 8, and we'll just go back to one of these. And there's our 10. And for this one, we need 1.5 inch strip. And again, we need 10 cuts. So I'm going to fold this one over. And these ones are 1.5 inch. So there's 4, 8, and 10. Color 7. So this is 1.5 inch strip. And again, we'll fold it over because I need 10 1.5 inch squares. So 4, 8, and 10. So there's our cuts for the blocks. We've got our binding. And the other piece I'm going to cut right now is the border. This is also going to be my backing fabric. But the backing I'll leave for later. So I need 3 2.5 inch strips. And as I said before, the backing I will cut later when my quilt top is finished. And then I need 2 pieces that are 2.5 by 15.5. And then these 2 strips need to be 46.5 inches long. Now the width of the fabric is not that long. I'm going to get about 40 inches or 40.5 inches or so out of each strip. So I need to add another 6 inches or so. So this piece is not quite enough to add 6 inches to both strips. So what I will do is cut a corner out of the other piece to make up the difference. And sometimes I'll just cut one a little bit longer than I need. And then after you sew it together, then I'll measure and trim it to the 46.5. Remember, you're adding a little bit of a seam here in order to connect the pieces. If you had lots of fabric, you could cut the length of the grain and get a 46.5 inch piece. But this is a more efficient use of fabric, which is really something that quilting is all about. So I'm going to cut that other piece later that I'm going to need to add to here rather than cut a whole strip off, although you could cut another whole strip off and use it to piece it as well. But there is enough fabric in the piece that's left there to do the backing and to do the extra piece that I will need for this one. So that's the border strips, and we are ready to start putting our quilt together. To prepare for sewing, I've laid out the pieces that I cut. It just barely fits on my table. And to construct this, we're actually going to work in blocks. If you download my instructions, there's a diagram on page 3 that shows how the blocks are split. And basically, if you cut across here, and then do the same thing at the bottom, what you end up with are 2 fairly large blocks here, and these 2 are identical. And then you have 6 blocks like this on the right in the center, and then 2 of these on each end. And then there's 2 little pieces on the end that are just 3 pieces of fabric that are sewn together. So when you put this together, I like to do similar blocks all at the same time. It speeds things up. I'm not having to go back and look, oh, how do I do this one again? So I'm going to start with the 2 small end blocks, and then I'm going to do the 6 blocks, and then I'll finish off with these 2 larger ones in the center. I'm starting with the 2 center end pieces that go at each end of the quilt. So we'll be stitching blue to gold and pressing, and then the second blue to the set. So I have a blue and a gold 2.5 inch square, 1/4 inch foot on my machine. And I'm doing 2 of these. I'm a thread trimmer. Some people leave threads and trim at the end. I need them trimmed as I go. And then you're going to press these towards the blue fabric away from the gold. So I'm just going to finger press here for right now. And then you're going to take the other blue square and put it in this position so that you'll have a piece that looks like this when you're done. And the same with the other one. And press these as well towards the blue and away from the gold. These are our 2 completed end pieces, and both pressed towards the blue fabrics, and the instructions do explain how to do the pressing as well as you're doing these. Now there are 6 blocks that are like this. The only difference is this is a center one, and so it's got a little bit longer sides on both sides, whereas this one goes on the end and one side is a little bit shorter. And so 4 of the blocks will have that shorter side, and 2 of them will be like this. But the method of sewing them together is exactly the same. For the video, I'm just going to work with this one block, but normally I would work with all 6 blocks at the same time and chain piece so that I would do all of the sides on all 6 of the blocks at one step. So here's the block. I'm going to start by sewing gold to blue along the right side of the block. And each of these is pressed towards the blue. So now I'm going to start piecing together the other side, and this one has to go in stages. So we start with this piece at the bottom. This will look like those 2 pieces that we did earlier, just with the smaller squares. And again, pressing toward the fabric piece that you just sewed on. So now I'm going to take this piece and stitch to these 2 pieces. When you press this one, you'll notice that I've continued the pressing and just made a 1/4 inch fold down at the bottom there. That is going to get mostly trimmed away when we're done, so it's fine to carry the fold on. So now we have our first corner piecing here. So this corner needs to match to this corner, and they should be pressed opposite directions if you've been following the pressing pattern to make that easier to butt those corners together. And you're going to stitch along this side right here. And the same for the final row here. So this side stitched and pressed, and then this side matching the corner again. Here we have our finished piece. I'm not sure what to call it. It's not exactly a block, but a partial block. And the front and the back. And you want to go ahead then and finish 5 more of these. I finished the 6 smaller blocks. And you want to just make sure when you do these that the end pieces are done correctly, because there is a longer strip on one side than on the opposite side. So you want mirror image of both of those pieces. And now we can begin working on the two larger blocks. So this is our larger block, and you can look on the instruction sheet and all of these pieces will be numbered and indicated in the order that they should be sewn together. I'll be starting by sewing these two pieces together, and then these two, and then work my way down, sewing a blue to a gold and pressing all of the seams towards the blue fabric in those strips. And these can all be done using chain piecing. So here are our pieces, the blues and the gold strips that have been sewn together and pressed towards the blue. And now we're going to start putting the block together. These end pieces are going to be added at the end. So you're going to start with the center piece on the one end and sew those two together. And then you're going to carry on similar to the previous block, sewing the one side and the other side and so on. So when you've got these two pieces sewn together, you have your corner matched, you're going to press towards the larger piece in this case. So the top part is finished, and I'll be adding the bottom two pieces. So I'm going to start with the strip on the left, sew that on and press towards that strip. And then I'll be adding the other piece and again pressing towards the strip. This is what the finished piece looks like. And now you will go ahead and sew the other one in the same manner that you sewed this one. So the blocks are sewn together, and now I'm going to stitch rows together. And not exactly rows, diagonal rows, I guess is what they are. So I'm going to start at this end. I'll be stitching these two pieces together here, and then this piece will go here, and this piece will go here. We'll shift the camera. And then same thing here. This will get sewn here, this piece here, and then these two pieces down here. And then once those diagonal rows are stitched, then I will start sewing those together. So I pressed the two end pieces towards the smaller block of the 3 squares that we sewed together. And then these two center panels are both pressed towards the center block. And what that will allow is when we go to sew these together, we have the pressing going the opposite way so we can nest these seams, and it makes it easier to get a nice matching corner at that point. So now I'm going to sew these 4 rows together so that I have a full quilt top. I am using a couple pins to put this together because I want those corners in the middle to match up nicely. So our quilt top is all put together, and now the sides need to be straightened. And it's a little tricky doing this, especially since my mat is not the size of the quilt, but I did it in stages. So I'll show you how I did it, and hopefully that will work for you as well. So I went to cut this and realized that I made a mistake piecing it and got some of my 3.5 and 4.5 inch pieces mixed up, and I was going to have a hole in this area of the quilt. So I had to switch out those pieces for a little bit longer piece. You have to watch out for those little things when you're putting your quilt together. So I'm lining up the points of the diamonds here, and I've got this angled so I think it fits better in the camera. And I'm putting my 1/4 inch mark on my ruler at the point here and the point here. And then I'm going to trim along that edge. And you may notice a couple little indents here, but my seam is wide enough to catch those. Now, if you are not an accurate sewer, then you might want to cut all of these strips a little bit longer than what I had in my measurements. So add an extra 1/2 inch or an extra inch to each of those strips, and then you'll make sure to have lots of length to work with. So then I'm going to swing this down further, and I'm going to line up again with those 2 diamonds. So that's the one side of the quilt. And then when I turn this, it should line up nicely with one of the horizontal lines on my cutting mat, which it does. So now I'm going to line this up on a line because I want this other side to be parallel. And again, I'm looking at those points, and this one might be out of the camera at the top, but I'm again lining up the 1/4 inch. But I'm also looking at where that is on my mat. And it's right around the 15 inch. My point here isn't lining up quite like I'd like it to. So here, it's a bit of give. And I'm just going to give it a little bit of a pull. And then I will turn it this way and square off the top. And again, I'm going a 1/4 inch past the point, but I'm also looking at where my ruler's lining up on the mat so that I have nice right angles on my corners. And the corners are a little bit angled there, but that's not going to be a problem once I get my border sewn on. There's enough seam allowance there to catch for that. So then other end, same thing. And I'm ready to put on my borders. And you could at this point measure and check that the borders that you cut earlier are going to fit on here. For this one, the measurement is to do the sides first and then to sew on the 2 end border pieces. I'm sewing on the border. I do not always pin the border when I'm doing the edges of a quilt, but because this is sewn so it's diagonal, we now have an edge that is on the bias, which means that it has some stretch. I don't want it to stretch while I'm sewing it. So I do have pins in, and I'm going to use those to help make sure that this does not stretch too much. And stitch the ends on and press towards the border. After the border is attached, then you can start building your quilt sandwich. So this is the backing that I'm using for this one. And because this is long and narrow, rather than buy a very long piece of fabric and have a lot left over, I decided to cut across the width and piece the fabric together. So I have two pieces here. The other one that I did, I used scraps that I had on hand, and so I did some piecing in the middle because I didn't have enough of the pieces that I was using for the backing. So you can do your back any way you want. I kept it simple because my quilting lines are diagonal. So I'm preparing to make the quilt sandwich. So I have my backing and my quilt bat. Both of these are cut to about the same size. They don't have to be perfect because they will be trimmed. And you want to make sure that they're nice and flat. And I usually flip it over as well and look at it from the back side, because if there's any ripples, those could potentially be tucks when you do your quilt stitching. And then back again. And I have my quilt top folded in half and quarters, so I can place it approximately center. This is a little easier with the smaller size quilts than when you are working with larger quilts. But most of my quilts are smaller ones. I've done a couple bed size quilts, but for the most part, I prefer to make lap quilts or table runners or pillows, or I've done lots of baby quilts. So I've got this all smoothed out. I have approximately the same distance all the way around. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect because we will be trimming. And then we're going to pin these together. Now, there are other ways to do this. This is my favorite way. And I just use safety pins. You can buy quilting pins to do this, but both work. So I'm starting in the center, and I'm going to work my way out, smoothing as I go. And if possible, I try and place pins so they won't be in the way when I actually do stitching. But if I need to move them, it's not difficult to take them out as I'm stitching. I'm going to be stitching in a pattern that follows the lines in the quilt. But for this particular quilt, I'm actually going to extend right off into the border with the diagonal lines. So most of them I'm going to eyeball, but I am going to mark a couple of the lines, well, maybe more than a couple, just to give me some guidelines, because when you are on the machine, sometimes it's a little hard to judge the accuracy when you're just eyeballing a line. And the pins are in the way, but I'll be able to correct that when I stitch it. So I'm actually going to be starting in the center and stitching this X, and then I'm going to work inside the pattern and then down towards the outside edges of the quilt. And it's ready to quilt. At the machine, I'm using a darker navy thread that matches my border color. So I'm going to try and sew carefully so that my stitching is straight, as it will show in the center parts of the quilt a little bit. I have a 7511 quilting needle. If you don't have a quilting needle, I've done quilting with a regular universal needle as well, and it works fine. But if you have the quilting needles, they are designed to work with the layers of batting and so on. I am using the walking foot that is a built-in feature on my sewing machine, but if you don't have that feature on yours, I do recommend investing in a walking foot. It's a great piece of equipment, and I use it for more than just quilting. And my stitch length is on 3. Because of the thickness, I like to use a little bit longer stitch. I'm going to be using a locking stitch that stitches in place to lock my stitches, although the ones on the very edge of the quilt aren't as essential because this will be sewn over later. So I've sewn the X in the center, and from this point on I'm going to do these pieces here on each side, and then I'll work my way down for the rest of the quilt. The quilting is done, and so now you want to take out any pins that might be left and trim all of these threads. And then we're going to trim the edges and we'll be ready for binding. I'm trimming this 2 1/4 inches from the inside of the border, which is the width that it should be. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that this line is not absolutely 100% straight, but it's very close to being straight. And if some of the batting is showing on the edges here, that is going to be covered up by my binding. So that's going to work for trimming. Now, if I had too much batting showing here, I'd maybe trim at 2 inches and just have the border just a tiny bit smaller. But this is going to work at the 2 1/4 inches. And do the same all the way around the quilt. To prep the binding, start by taking the 4 strips that you cut for binding, and you're going to stitch those together into one very long strip. So right sides together and a 1/4 inch seam. At the ironing board, press your seams open. And then you're going to press this strip wrong sides together in half the long way. There are a lot of ways to sew binding on a quilt, but I'm going to show you my favorite method, at least my favorite method for the moment. So I've got my strip of folded binding, and I'm going to take it and fold the end diagonally, like so. And I'm just going to finger press this bias. Now you could do this at the iron. And then just fold this back down. And so now you have this kind of triangle right here with a little gap that we're going to use to tuck our end in as we come around. I'm using the navy thread, and I know this is gold. I am going to switch for the top stitching, but this first row of stitching is mostly hidden, but if it shows, it's going to show on the back of my quilt. And so if I use the darker navy thread, then it's not going to be as visible. So I'm using navy thread for this step, and then I'm going to switch out to a gold thread for the top stitching. And I like to start in the middle of an edge. Do not start at a corner. It's very difficult to make it look neat if you start at the corner. So you want to start somewhere in the edge. I'm using one of the long edges. Doesn't really matter exactly where you start. And I'm starting on the back of the quilt. So I'm lining up my binding with the edge here. And I have also switched out to a regular presser foot, and I'm going to use the edge of the foot as my guideline. And it's a little bit wider than a 1/4 inch, but I find I like having that little bit of extra when I'm folding over my binding. And if you don't want to, you can use your 1/4 inch and it's not a problem. So we're going to start by back stitching. And then I'm going to sew up to the corner, and then I'm going to show you how I deal with the corner. So I'm approaching my corner. I'm going to be stopping about 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters from the corner. And I'm just going to eyeball it, but if that's going to be difficult for you to eyeball, you can put a pin at the point where you want to stop. So I'm just stitching up to 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to backstitch and cut my threads. And I do check it. If I'm not exactly 1/4 inch, then I would stitch a little further, but that one's pretty good. Now, how do you turn the corner so that you have a nice mitered corner when you're done? So I'm turning this. So this is the row of stitching that I just sewed. And I'm going to fold this straight up from the edge that I just sewed. So now I've got this diagonal right here. My stitching ends right there. And then I'm going to take this and fold it down so it lines up with the edge. So I have this triangle that's just loose here, and it's going to stay loose until I fold it to the other side and finish it. Now I'm going to start stitching 1/4 inch from the top and 1/4 inch from the side. So that should meet this stitching that I just did. And again, if you want to put a pin in to use as a guide point, you can. I'm just using my eye. And then you sew to the next corner and do the same thing again. So 1/4 inch backstitch, cut your threads, turn, fold up, fold down, make sure you got your little triangle, and then starting 1/4 inch away. So I'm coming up to the point where I started. So I'm going to take this and I want to cut it so it's right even with where the diagonal is crossed by the stitching here. So that's here. And then tuck this end in neatly. And if you accidentally cut it too long, you just trim it off a little more. And sew right across. So now I'm going to switch thread colors, and then I'll show you how to flip this over to the other side. When I stitch from the right side, I like to start close to where my overlap is here at the edge of my binding. And so I'm now going to be wrapping the binding over the edge and just covering my row of stitching on the right side here. Now, if you find that your binding isn't quite covering that, you can trim this edge a little bit shorter if you need to. But if you sew accurately, I usually find that I don't need to do that. So now I'm just covering the edge. I'm going to be sewing very close to the edge of the binding. So we're coming up to the corner, and I'm just grabbing my tailor's awl that I like to use on corners. Sew a little further here. So you're folding just straight up with the seam, but I'm now going to use my awl, and you can use a seam ripper or another tool as well if you don't have one of these. I just really like this. And you're going to then fold the other edge up. And if everything was stitched properly on the other side, you should get a nice little mitered corner here. And I'm going to use my awl. This is why I like the awl. It's kind of hard to hold it with your fingers. And I also need to sew very close. And the awl has a very fine tip, so I can almost sew on top of it. And then once you've caught this edge, lift your foot, pivot, and start down the next side. And I just fold as I go. Coming up to the next corner here. Here's our finished table runner. So thank you for joining me today. I hope that you've been inspired to make your own version of the Sapphire and Sunlight table runner, or some variation of it, maybe not in Sapphire and Sunlight colors, but in whatever colors bring you joy. Thank you for joining me today. Have a great day.